Banani family and friends, we are back with the APC series and it's your girl Nthabi. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. And before we get any further, I would just like to thank all the 500 subscribers. Thank you. Thank you so much for the love and support and sharing content and leaving comments in the comment section. And I just hope that I'm able to help you, cross the finish line at the end of, the year when you're writing your APC board exam, where you're going to be #competent and be a CASA. So let's get into the business of the day. I got a request from one of the APC candidates stating that they would like assistance in how to prepare for an accounting trigger, an auditing trigger, finance and taxation. Because obviously, as much as we deal with multidisciplinary, integration of everything, there's always just one question that specifically majors in that specific discipline, and then maybe the other modules feature in the specific question, but it's not a major thing. But let's say in document 4, it's a major auditing trigger, right? It's mainly auditing. So you just want to know how to approach that. And this is the video where I'm going to assist you in how to approach research for specific disciplines, right? But just a disclaimer, right? This is just general questions, and you always just have to link everything back to the case study. Just like how you're going to use the AI tool, it's going to give you general answers, but you need to tailor it according to the needs of your entity, as well as make it specific to the case study and the entity, because there's no point in information dumping, right? SACA does not test you on that. It tests you on applying professional judgment and being able to apply yourself in the exam, and just use those critical thinking skills when you're doing your research, right? So this is just going to give you a roadmap into what to do and how to prepare for the specific disciplines. The first discipline we are going to break down is accounting. But the first mistake I made when I was a candidate was when I would think that the knowledge I acquired in CTA and when I was doing ITC does not apply, right? I need to apply professional judgment. And yes, that is the case. However, you still need to solidify your technical knowledge, right? Because you need to build on that, right? So one of the things that I struggled with was coverage and depth, and it was just a lot. I did not understand. But then when I had my mentor, they told me that coverage relates to the scope of that specific standard, right? And depth relates to you applying that standard, but also making it relevant to the case study and the industry, and explaining why that specific standard was triggered and is relevant in answering that specific email, right? So for example, you needed to explain why, if IFRS 16 was triggered, you need to explain the coverage, right? You're going to say maybe you're explaining to someone who does not have accounting knowledge. You're going to say, in order for IFRS 16 to be applicable, right, the contract has to have elements of controlling the use of that identified asset for a specific period of time in exchange for consideration, right? That is the scope of the IFRS 16. However, in applying that, I need to state that, okay, the terms of the contract state A, B, and C, and the item that is going to be leased is A, B, and C, and therefore, IFRS 16 is applicable. However, you need to elaborate on that, because now this is when you're going to apply the principles in the case study to explain to that specific individual why IFRS 16 is relevant, right? So I basically battled between coverage and depth, but then with my mentor, they said that if you're going to quote a standard, you need to be able to explain and convince the reader why that is applicable in the specific response. So with that being said, with an accounting trigger, we're going to go back to basics, right? So how I prepared for an accounting trigger was that I had the scope of that specific standard, right? But not only did I have the IFRS book itself, I eventually realized that going into the exam with that book and flipping through the pages is not going to help me, right? So what I did was that I took that specific section that's relevant and I printed it out and I highlighted it and wrote reasons why it is applicable according to the pre-release information. So going back to basics, what does that mean? It means you are covering the criteria of why that IFRS is relevant. And number two, when you discover that it meets the criteria of that standard, you need to explain how you're going to recognize it initially, and then you're going to go into initial measurement, you're going to go into subsequent treatments, and then you're going to look at the presentation and disclosure of that specific item, right? Because at the end of the day, your technical knowledge is the foundation to any trigger you may come across for accounting. You need to be able to understand scope, initial recognition and measurement, subsequent presentation and disclosure, because that is where you're going to rely on, the foundation and actually answering in the response. So that is what I prepared. Every single time an accounting trigger was mentioned, then I would look at the Big Four. They have the articles, right? I would look at that, but also apply the principles. But one thing that I never did was use the AI tool to answer a accounting trigger. The reason why I say that is because the AI tool is a robot. Obviously, it cannot apply professional judgment. And sometimes the accounting treatments for that is very shaky, right? So that's when you go back to basics. When you need to understand a specific treatment, you go back to how the standard is structured, initial recognition and measurement, subsequent presentation and disclosure, right? And when you're writing the information in your file, you are not just rewriting the IFRS standard. No, you are writing the standard, let's say on the left-hand side, and then you're going back to basics in terms of line by line, explaining why that standard is applicable and how you're going to measure it. If there's amounts that are included in the pre-release, calculate that specific thing that you need to calculate to make it easier for yourself, so that you can have the formulas already, right? You have an understanding of how you're going to apply this IFRS, right? So one thing that will really help you is print out that specific section in the IFRS that is applicable and apply it while you are in pre-release. Don't wait for the IOD to come out for you to actually open that IFRS book. No, open it while you're in pre-release so that you can have that specific research for yourself and actually understand why this is relevant for your research, right? Because remember, we touch on relevant researching. You can't just say IAS 2 is applicable. Why is it applicable, right? You can't just name IFRS 15, it's applicable. Why is it applicable? And specifically, why is it applicable to this document, right? So that is how you need to approach an accounting trigger. And then we move on to taxation, right? Taxation can be quite tricky. However, you need to go back to basics, like I mentioned, right? Number one, you always have to remember when there is a tax treatment and there's a tax implication, it is VAT and it is income tax implications, right? So that is a tax treatment. You need to cover income tax and you also need to cover the VAT Act, right? So that will really help you with regards to covering the two bases, because sometimes in your expectation table, they're going to say income tax implications and then VAT implications, but you forgot the VAT implications. Obviously, if you're at a C with your answering, you're going to move down to a BC because you didn't cover everything on that expectation table on the grading grid, right? And with regards to how to approach it, we go back to basics again. Just like in accounting, we deal with the scope first and the application of it, right? But I feel like when I was doing the APC last year, I thought that the scope and the application was like ITC level, but it actually was not. When you have the scope of the standard, the section in the legislation, you're going to state this is applicable because, and then you cover it, and then now you're going to apply your professional judgment. This is now when you're going to analyze that, okay, the taxation treatment is like this, and the reason why I say this is because of A, B, and C. You're not going to make that section applicable. You are also going to elaborate on why it is applicable, how it affects the company, how it affects the profits of that company, how it affects the gross income, and all of that, right? You need to cover the overall tax position of that company, right? But remember, it's dependent on what is actually triggered, right? You need to break down taxation and how it affects that specific line item or whatever they are asking you. But then you must also consider how it affects the overall tax position of that specific company, right? But just remember, if it's a tax implication, it is income tax and VAT, unless they explicitly state what are the income tax implications. Then you only include Income Tax Act and nothing else. And then we move to auditing, right? Auditing used to be my weakness. I never liked auditing, but then I had to make peace with the fact that I'm writing about auditing and it's not going to go away. So one of the things that I had to accept was the fact that I need to understand the audit process. I need to understand why I have certain procedures in place. I need to understand how to identify specific risks, and all of that. So I knew that in order to pass the auditing task, I need to understand the entire process of from planning to execution to reporting to the Companies Act, APA, CPC. I need to understand where everything fits in. And with auditing, as much as you can practice it on a daily basis, right? Sometimes they trigger things that you didn't even do at work, right? Let's say it's the PPE section. You've never touched PPE while you were working because it was allocated to someone else. So I just feel like I had to sit down and go back to basics, like I said, and have specific questions that will guide me on how to actually approach that specific auditing question. So every time I used to look at an auditing trigger, right, in the document, I used to follow a specific step, right? So now the first thing I would look at is the assertions that are affected. And the reason why I focused on assertions is because if I know what assertion is affected, I will know the risk that is arising. I will know how to respond to that specific trigger, right? So if I know that, okay, cutoff is an issue, then I know that the risk is with cutoff and I need to have procedures that respond to that specific risk, right? If I know it's an understatement or an overstatement, I know that if it's an understatement, then obviously completeness would be an issue. If it's an overstatement, then it would be an existence issue. You get it? So the first thing I would ask myself is, what assertions are affected in what I'm reading? The second thing would be, what is the risk associated with that assertion and what is causing that risk? I would have to look at now, if I'm identifying a risk, I need to check, where is this risk coming from? Is it a control risk? Is it coming from a lack of controls, or controls are not working effectively, or like what is causing it, right? And I would have to assess the risk related to that specific line item, right? So I would have to understand, because now we're going to be in the phase of ISA 315, where you need to identify the risk of material misstatement and also assess it, right? That's when you're going to assess the assertions that affect it. You need to rate it, whether it's low, moderate, high, or significant. And you need to justify why you're rating it that way, right? So we are at that level of risk assessments, risk identification, ISA 315, and all of that, right? So now the third thing we need to look at is how to mitigate that risk, right? Because we all know that sometimes in auditing, the way to go is having a risk-based approach, right? So you have the risk, and now to have the risk-based approach, that's when you're going to have procedures targeting that risk to respond to it and reduce that risk, right? So now you're going to have tailor-made procedures in your pre-release period. Yes, the 5 days. You already have assertions that relate to that specific trigger. You have the risk and you have identified it. Now you are going to have procedures, as much as maybe they might not have asked you like for the procedures, but you are going to prepare yourself because it's a what if, right? You are going to have procedures that are tailor-made to respond to those risks specifically. So what do procedures look like? So just like an ordinary working paper you're completing at work, your procedures must address a specific assertion. So now you're going to go back to the assertion that you identified, right? And then number 2, your procedures must speak to the risk that you identified. It must address it. So when you're drafting procedures, right, you need to understand the direction of testing as well, because number 1, you already know the assertion that you're trying to address and the risk that you are trying to mitigate, right? However, in order to be specific to that risk mitigation, you need to understand the direction of testing, right? What does that mean? you need to know what you're agreeing with what. So that means you need to know the documents you are using in your procedures. Yes, in the pre-release information, they might not have triggered that, but it's a what if scenario as well, because you are going to draft procedures in the pre-release period. However, you don't know what documents you need to request or documents that they will provide for you on the day. So what if now on the day they tell you, please give procedures on how to address the accuracy assertion, and please also let us know what documents we will need, right? You will need to perform those procedures. And now you are puzzled because you don't know how to respond to it because you didn't prepare for it in pre-release. Whereas when you were busy in the 5 days, you tackled the assertions, you tackled the risk, you did the identification and assessment of it, you tackled the procedures, right? But you did not tackle the documents. So now we are trying to cover the holistic perspective, and you're trying to have an overall view of the what if scenario that can come out on the day. So how do you even start with what document you will need, right? How do you even get that information? Where do you even get that information, right? So I would suggest that you go on the AI tool and you are basically explaining, if it's a business process that they want you to assess, you go on the AI tool, you copy that business process and you paste it so that it knows what it has to do. And then after that, you're going to say, okay, I am an auditor in this specific entity, in the specific industry, and these are the assertions I'm trying to, respond to. So these are the risks that were identified. However, my procedures need to be specific in mitigating those risks. Therefore, can you please elaborate on what documents I will need to corroborate this evidence, right? And the AI tool will give you a list of everything. And obviously, you are only going to document what is relevant, because some supporting documentation that they provide for you is not going to be relevant to your case study. Because remember, the AI tool is a robot. You are a person applying professional judgment, and you need to apply that when you are trying to compile your list, right? So that is one thing that can help you with regards to just preparing for a document or supporting evidence question. So the AI tool might say you need invoices or external confirmation from banks or lawyer confirmations, whatever line item you're dealing with, right? So it is up to you to just apply that information and make it relevant to you and the case study. So in your file, what will you have in the auditing question, right? You obviously have the assertions affected, the risk you identified, and how you actually assessed. You did the risk of material misstatement assessment. You've assessed it and you've concluded on whether the risk is high, low, moderate, or significant, right? And then you also have like backup procedures just in case they ask you, or you have the supporting documentation, right? That is how to approach the assurance aspect of an auditing trigger, right? And then with regards to internal controls, I have explained in detail in the internal controls video that I recently uploaded. So it is my last upload from this video. And then with regards to ethics, I covered that in detail as well. So it does cover Companies Act, APA, CPC, King, as well as anything ethics related, right? So I did a part 1 and a part 2 video of how to approach ethics. So it will do you great justice to yourself to go back to those videos and actually look at how to answer an internal control question, how to actually prepare for it, how to actually prepare for an ethics question while in pre-release, because many people tend to wait for the IOD and it's not supposed to be like that. So part 1 and part 2 ethics is out on the YouTube channel, so you can just go back to it for reference. And I just hope that it's able to help you cover the holistic preparation view of, the pre-release period. And then the last module, we move to finance. So finance is not really as in-depth, as the other modules, and it's more of your professional judgment, more than just calculations. But obviously, in order to prepare for it, you need to see what is explicitly triggered, right, to get that technical contents correct. But with regards to finance, it's not only about the calculation. Yes, you can prepare the valuation from scratch. Yes, you can prepare the capital budgeting. But what point is there to prepare that if you don't understand that calculation? Because you don't know on the day if they're going to say evaluate the calculation or they're going to say provide us with the calculation from scratch, right? So if you evaluate it, if you don't know what goes where, how will you be able to answer it, right? So just make sure that whatever is explicitly stated, you go through the calculations and then you know the theory behind it. Because like you need to know why depreciation is excluded from capital budgets. You need to know that, right? You always need to ask yourself why, right? Everything that is excluded, ask yourself why. And if there is a calculation that is not making sense, you need to know why it's not making sense, right? For example, in your capital budgeting, you know that you have to also take into account the opportunity cost, right, of that specific decision, or you need to take into account the cost that you save because these things are happening because you are taking option A instead of option 2, well, option B. But yeah, you need to understand the theory thoroughly and be able to explain the calculations behind it. Then number 2, you have to understand the strategic considerations when you are making a decision, when you are expected to evaluate something strategically or give qualitative considerations, right? That's like a strategic considerations question, right? So in the strategic considerations video, I cover everything from what to consider in terms of profitability, what to consider in terms of how it's going to affect your stakeholders, how it's going to affect your overall decision, the risks that you need to look out for. So if you can go back to that specific video on how to actually evaluate a business decision by considering the key strategic considerations, then that will really help you. But that is how I approach the different disciplines in the pre-release information. And just a disclaimer again, this is not just set questions on what to ask the internet or what to ask the AI tool. It is just to provide a roadmap on, the path you need to take just to make sure that you don't get lost. Because I used to go into this wormhole and research so many things, but when I get to the exam, I'm not even using those things that I'm researching. So I think having the set structure, it helped me break down everything, and also it helped me do relevant researching and not just researching anything and everything, right? Because you end up just getting confused. So we have reached the end of our episode, and I hope that it was valuable to you and was insightful, and you know how we do it here at home. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section first before you hit that email button, because like I said, chances are you are not the only person with that specific question. So the email address is apcplug101@gmail.com. And just a disclaimer, guys, I'm experiencing a high volume of emails. So if you can just be patient with me in my response time, I try my best to just, respond to you when I can, because I am also a trainee. Just like you, I'm a trainee. So during the day, I'm at work. And when I come back from work, I try to respond to certain emails. I respond to them in batches. So if I haven't responded to your email, I will get to it. And I'll make sure that I am able to help you to the best of my ability. But keep the emails coming and the comments coming. Your support is really appreciated. And I am very glad and I'm very happy that I'm able to assist you guys in making sure that you reach that C level at the end of the year. So thank you so much everyone for tuning in. And this is me signing out on this episode of the APC series. And I hope you just enjoy your day.